A young black teenager is walking home from school when a police car pulls up beside him. The officer gets out, eyes narrowed, and starts questioning him like he's a criminal. But what the officer doesn't know is that the teenager isn't just anyone. He's the heir to a fortune worth billions, and today his life is about to change forever. What happens next will shock you. It was a hot afternoon in the middle of the summer when Marcus, a 16-year-old teenager, was walking home from school. He had just finished his final exam and was ready to meet his friends at the corner cafe to talk about their plans for the summer. He wasn't in a rush. He liked the quiet, calm walk through the neighborhood. The streets were familiar to him, filled with the sound of kids playing and the distant hum of traffic. His worn-out sneakers scuffed the pavement as he moved, his backpack hanging loosely from his shoulder. He had been walking these streets for years, but today something felt different. As he passed by the local park, a police car pulled up beside him. The window rolled down, and the officer inside stared at him with a look that made Marcus feel uneasy. The officer, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and a sour expression, leaned out of the window. "Hey, you there," the officer called, his voice sharp and loud. "What are you doing around here? You look suspicious." Marcus stopped and looked at him, confused. "I'm just walking home," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The officer narrowed his eyes. "Walking home, huh? From where?" He didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he stepped out of the car and approached Marcus with slow, deliberate steps. "I don't see many kids like you around here. What's your name?" the officer asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Marcus frowned, starting to feel the weight of the officer's questioning. "My name is Marcus. I live around the corner." The officer looked him up and down, his gaze lingering on Marcus's clothes, a simple t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers. "You don't look like you belong around here," the officer muttered under his breath, almost to himself. Marcus's heart started to race. Something didn't feel right. He had been stopped by the police before, but it was always for silly things like not wearing his helmet while riding his bike or accidentally jaywalking. This felt different. The officer wasn't just asking questions, he was making assumptions. "I'm just trying to get home, sir," Marcus said, trying to stay calm. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer didn't seem to care about his words. Instead, he took out his phone and started typing something, never once breaking his stare at Marcus. "I don't trust you," the officer muttered. "You're probably up to something. You can't just be walking around here looking the way you do." Marcus felt a wave of frustration rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay quiet. He had learned from his father not to make things worse with the police. His father always told him to stay calm, no matter what. But the officer wasn't finished. He reached for his radio and called in for backup, his tone making it clear that he expected Marcus to be a troublemaker. "Got a kid here, black teen, suspicious behavior, might be involved in something illegal. Need backup." Marcus's stomach twisted. He couldn't believe what was happening. He had done nothing wrong. He was just a teenager, no different from any of the other kids in his school. Yet this officer saw him as something to fear, something to question without cause. As the officer continued to talk into his radio, Marcus took a deep breath. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep his cool. But before he could say anything more, another police car pulled up and two more officers stepped out. The situation was escalating, and Marcus could feel the eyes of people on the street turning toward him, some curious, others uncomfortable. The officer who had originally stopped him walked back to his car, still talking into his radio. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, unsure of what was going to happen next. He had never been arrested, never even been in serious trouble. But now, for some reason, it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. The officers surrounded him, and one of them, a woman, looked him up and down with a look of disbelief. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice sharp. "He's being difficult," the officer with the mustache replied. "Won't tell me anything. just standing here acting like he's done nothing wrong. Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. It was as if they had already made up their minds about him. They saw him as a criminal, someone to arrest and question, no matter how innocent he appeared. The idea of being arrested for something he didn't even understand was terrifying. "I didn't do anything wrong," Marcus repeated, his voice shaking now. "You can check my backpack. You'll see I'm just a student. I'm not involved in anything illegal." The officers didn't seem to hear him. They had already decided that he was guilty of something. The woman officer stepped forward and grabbed his arm, roughly pulling him toward the police car. Marcus was in shock. What was happening? Why was he being treated like this? It was only when the officer started searching his backpack that Marcus's mind raced. Did they know who he was? Did they have any idea that he was the heir to a fortune? Someone who could change everything with a single phone call? No, they didn't. They saw only a black teenager, a kid they thought didn't belong. They didn't see the future of a vast empire, the son of a man with millions of dollars in the bank. Marcus stood there, trying to keep his emotions in check. He couldn't believe that all of this was happening to him. He was just trying to get home, yet now he was being treated like a criminal. A moment ago he had been walking the streets without a care, and now his life was suddenly being turned upside down. And what he didn't know yet, what neither he nor the officers could have imagined, was that this small, seemingly insignificant encounter would soon shake the very foundation of their world. The officers were relentless in their questioning, their voices growing louder as they surrounded Marcus. They seemed to have no intention of letting him go. The woman officer, whose name Marcus had never caught, held his arm tighter, as though trying to make him submit to their control. Her fingers pressed into his skin, and though he tried to stay calm, it was becoming harder to breathe under the weight of their assumptions. "I told you, I'm just trying to get home," Marcus said again, his voice now a little louder. But the fear that had been creeping into him was impossible to hide. The officers didn't listen. They were focused on the way he looked, the way his hoodie hung low, the way his sneakers were worn down. To them, those were signs of trouble, of someone who didn't belong. But to Marcus, they were just signs of a life lived on a budget, not a reflection of who he was. The mustached officer came back to Marcus with an air of superiority, as if he was in complete control of the situation. "Well, you're not just walking home now, are you?" he sneered. "You're a suspect. I'm placing you under arrest for loitering and suspicion of illegal activity." Marcus's heart sank. He couldn't believe it. Arrested for walking home? The world around him seemed to blur as the officer reached for his handcuffs, the cold metal glinting in the late afternoon sun. He wanted to protest, wanted to scream that this wasn't right, but the more he tried to speak, the more they just dismissed him. Their minds were already made up, and he was powerless to change it. "Just wait until we get this figured out," the woman officer said, her voice devoid of sympathy. "You'll be fine, but we have to do this by the book." As they pushed him toward the patrol car, Marcus couldn't help but notice the few people who had stopped to watch. Some had their phones out recording, while others whispered to each other. He wanted to shout at them, to tell them to do something, anything, to stop what was happening. But he didn't. His mouth felt dry, and his hands were shaking in the cold cuffs. But despite the growing humiliation and anger inside him, something in Marcus refused to break. He wasn't some random teenager to be dismissed. He wasn't just the suspect they had labeled him as. There was more to him than they could see. He could feel the frustration rising inside him, but he held it in, knowing that if he lost control now, it would only make things worse. His thoughts flickered to his father. He had never spoken to him about his wealth, the family legacy that ran deep in his blood, but Marcus knew, even without saying the words aloud, that he came from a powerful family, a family that could change this whole situation in an instant. Still, he wasn't ready to reveal that yet. He had to do this on his own, prove that he was more than just the image they saw. As the officers pushed him into the back of the car, The world outside seemed to go quiet, the sound of the street fading into a dull hum. It was a strange feeling, as though time had slowed down. He glanced at the dashboard, at the flashing lights reflecting off the window, and then at the officer sitting in front of him. The officer hadn't looked at him once, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing that made sense in the world. Marcus's thoughts were racing. He could feel the tension building up, an invisible weight pressing down on him. What had he done to deserve this? Why was it so easy for them to assume the worst about him? And what was he supposed to do now? As the car rolled through the streets, the situation seemed to grow even more absurd. His mind kept drifting back to his father, Robert Kingsley, the man who had built an empire from the ground up. Marcus didn't know what the police would think of that if they ever found out. They wouldn't believe it, not for a second. To them, he was just another black teen, just another suspicious character to add to their list of criminals. They couldn't see beyond the color of his skin, couldn't see beyond the assumptions they'd already made. Marcus wanted to laugh, but the tension in his chest wouldn't allow it. No, they didn't know who he was. No one did, not really. He was the heir to a fortune, the rightful successor to Kingsley Enterprises. But here he was, sitting in the back of a police car as though he were any other kid off the street. The irony was almost too much to bear. The ride seemed to take forever. Every second that passed, Marcus felt more and more disconnected from the world outside. His phone had long been taken away, and the silence in the car only made everything worse. He wasn't sure where they were taking him, or if they even cared. All he knew was that he needed to stay calm, but inside he was shaking. As they pulled up to the police station, Marcus could feel the eyes of the officers on him. It wasn't just the fear of being arrested, it was the realization that they had no idea who they were dealing with. And when they found out, when they finally realized the truth, it would be too late. Too late for them to take back the assumptions they'd made, too late for them to erase the humiliation, too late for them to undo the damage they had caused. Marcus swallowed hard, steadying his breath. He wasn't just a kid being picked up off the street. He was someone who could change everything, and he was going to make sure they knew it. The sound of the car door slamming shut echoed through Marcus's mind as the officers led him into the station. His heart beat loudly in his chest, a constant reminder of how wrong this all was. As they walked through the station's doors, the sharp clacking of their boots on the cold tile floor seemed to drown out everything else. Officers were going about their business, some talking, some typing away at computers, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in the hallway. They walked Marcus to a holding cell, his legs feeling like lead with every step. The officers barely glanced at him, their attention focused on their own duties. He couldn't help but notice how everything felt so normal to them, as if treating someone like him was an everyday routine. To them, he was just another statistic, another black teenager caught in the system, just another person they could label and forget about. As they pushed him into the small, dimly lit cell, Marcus finally let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His back pressed against the cold metal bars, and he glanced around the tiny room. There was nothing special about it. It was like every other holding cell he had seen in TV shows or movies. The same gray walls, the same uncomfortable bench. But it was real now. This wasn't a movie. This was his life. The officer who had first approached him stood by the bars, arms crossed, his eyes scanning Marcus like he was a specimen under a microscope. He hadn't spoken much since the arrest, but now he looked at Marcus as if he were expecting some kind of reaction. Marcus refused to give him the satisfaction. "You know," the officer began, breaking the silence, "we don't usually arrest people like you. People like you don't hang around these parts. You're either here because you did something or because you're hiding something." Marcus turned his head slightly, staring the officer down. "What do you mean, people like me?" His voice was quiet but firm. He wasn't sure how much longer he could stay calm, but he knew he needed to. The officer's smirk faded slightly, and he shifted on his feet, clearly taken aback. "I mean people who look like you, kids who don't belong here, you know? Troublemakers." Marcus's jaw clenched. "Just because I look a certain way doesn't mean I'm a troublemaker." He took a deep breath, trying to keep his anger in check. "But you don't care about that, do you?" The officer hesitated. For a moment it seemed like he wanted to say something more, but instead he just grunted and turned to walk away. "We'll see about that. Someone will come for you soon." As the officer left, the heavy door of the station slammed behind him. Marcus was alone now, but even alone, he wasn't helpless. He had always been taught that no matter how bad things seemed, there was always a way out. This situation wasn't different. It wasn't the end. As the minutes stretched on, Marcus's thoughts began to race. What was he supposed to do now? How was he supposed to get out of this mess? His mind kept coming back to his father, Robert Kingsley. The name echoed in his head, and it sent a chill down his spine. His father, the man who had built a vast empire in real estate, a man of immense wealth and influence. Marcus had never flaunted it. He had always kept his family's legacy under wraps, living a simple life, not wanting to draw attention to himself. But now here he was, in a police station, wrongly accused, treated like a criminal. He felt a small sense of relief wash over him as he thought about his father. There was no way this would go unnoticed. No way his father would let them treat him like this. But then a part of Marcus questioned whether it was right to call his father. His father had always insisted that Marcus handle things on his own, to be his own man. The door to the holding cell opened, and Marcus was jerked out of his thoughts. A woman in a suit stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She wasn't an officer, he could tell by her clothes and the way she carried herself. She had a professional air about her, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately made everyone else feel like they were standing in her shadow. She glanced at Marcus with a cool expression before turning to the officer who had arrested him. "Is this the one?" she asked, her voice calm but authoritative. The officer nodded. "Yes, ma'am. We've got him. Caught him loitering and acting suspicious. We're trying to get him to talk, but he's being difficult." The woman studied Marcus for a moment longer before raising an eyebrow. "I'm sure he is, but you do realize you've made a mistake, don't you?" Marcus blinked in surprise. "A mistake?" he asked, unsure of what she meant. The officer seemed to bristle at the woman's comment. "What do you mean, a mistake?" The woman turned back to Marcus, her eyes softening just a fraction. "You're not what you appear to be, are you?" she asked, her voice almost like a whisper. Marcus swallowed hard. He had no idea what this woman knew, but it was clear she wasn't like the others. She seemed to have a different level of understanding. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said, trying to keep his guard up. She smiled slightly, a knowing glint in her eyes. "Let's just say that this situation might not be as bad for you as you think. I'm here to help you. But I'm going to need you to trust me." Marcus felt a flicker of hope, something he hadn't felt since the arrest. Could she actually be on his side? What did she know that the others didn't? For the first time, he allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, things could turn around. But one thing was clear. He couldn't stay in this cell forever. And the truth? The truth was about to change everything. The woman didn't wait for Marcus to respond. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the floor as she pulled out a folder from her briefcase. She flipped it open, revealing several documents. For a moment, Marcus couldn't make sense of what he was looking at, but something about the way she handled them made him feel like this wasn't just a routine visit. The papers were neatly arranged, almost as if they had been prepared in advance, and they didn't look like they were about to be used in a regular case. "You don't belong here, Marcus," she said, her voice soft, but filled with certainty. "You've been through something that most people can't even begin to understand." Marcus raised an eyebrow, confused. "How do you know my name?" He hadn't told anyone, not even the officers, what his full name was. The woman smiled, but it wasn't the smile of someone who had figured out a simple mystery. It was more like someone who had already uncovered the deepest secrets and was now revealing them one by one. "I know more than you think," she replied, "and I know exactly who you are. I also know that you're not just another kid from the street. You're not a suspect, and I'm not here to arrest you." Marcus felt his heart race. Who was this woman? What was she really here for? He was still trapped in this holding cell, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger going on. "Why am I here then?" Marcus asked, the confusion in his voice clear. "I didn't do anything wrong. I don't belong here." The woman's eyes softened for a second, then she reached out and touched the bars of the cell. "You don't belong in this situation at all," she said, her tone now gentle. "But these officers, they're doing their job based on what they see, and what they see is someone they think they can control." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" She took a step back and looked at him, her expression serious. "You don't look like you fit the image they have in their heads of what a person like you should be. So, they're going to treat you however they want." For a moment, Marcus felt a bitter knot in his stomach. He understood that the woman was talking about how they had treated him, like a criminal, even though he had done nothing wrong. But the mention of people like him stung in ways he couldn't fully explain. He'd spent so much of his life not fitting into the boxes people tried to place him in. The woman tilted her head, studying him closely. "I'm here because I know who you really are. I know about your family. Your father is Robert Kingsley, right? The man who built Kingsley Enterprises from the ground up?" Marcus's mouth went dry. How did she know that? Was she part of his father's business? Was she connected to his family's wealth in some way? He had never wanted anyone to know his true identity, especially not in situations like this. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. "How do you know that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She leaned in slightly, her eyes fixed on his with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Because your father's business is one of the most influential in this city, Marcus, and you're the heir. You don't just belong to a family with money, you belong to a legacy. But right now, that's not what people see when they look at you. They don't see the son of a billionaire. They see someone to arrest, someone to treat with disrespect." Marcus stared at her in disbelief. His secret, the one he had kept hidden for so long, was out in the open. His heart raced again, not from fear, but from something else: confusion, anger, maybe even a little relief. For so long, he had avoided stepping into his father's world, kept his identity secret to live as just a regular teenager. But here, in this moment, with the woman standing before him, everything was different. His world was about to collide with the truth in ways he wasn't ready for. "You've been living in the shadows for too long, Marcus," the woman continued, "but you don't have to anymore. Your family's fortune is yours, and it's time you start taking control of it. And it's time you take control of this situation." Her words hit Marcus hard, and for a moment he felt a strange sense of power wash over him. He wasn't just the kid caught in a mess anymore. He wasn't the suspect, the nameless teenager in a holding cell. He was Marcus Kingsley, the heir to one of the largest real estate empires in the country. This was his moment, and for the first time, he realized that it wasn't about him getting out of this mess. It was about showing everyone who he really was. "Are you saying I should tell them who I am?" Marcus asked, his voice steady now, a far cry from the confusion and fear he had felt just moments ago. The woman nodded. "Yes, Marcus, it's time to stop hiding, but when you do, make sure they understand exactly who they've been treating." For a brief moment, Marcus thought about his father again. Robert Kingsley, the man who had worked tirelessly to build his empire, the man who had never asked for anything but success. And here was his son, caught in a web of racial prejudice, treated like a criminal simply because of his appearance. Marcus's hands balled into fists at his sides. He was done being treated like this. No longer would he let them assume things about him. He wasn't going to hide anymore. It was time for them to see who they were dealing with. "I'm done," he muttered under his breath. "I'm done hiding." The woman smiled, sensing his shift in confidence. "Good, because when you walk out of here, it's not just about clearing your name. It's about showing them that they messed with the wrong person." Marcus nodded, his resolve building with every passing second. They had no idea who he was, no idea who they were really dealing with, but they were about to find out. The woman turned and walked toward the door of the holding cell, her heels clicking with every step. Marcus followed her movements, his mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions. He had spent his entire life hiding behind the identity of a regular teenager, trying to live under the radar, away from the weight of his family's wealth and legacy. But now, everything was changing. His heart pounded in his chest as he realized that the moment of truth was approaching, and he was no longer going to be invisible. The woman opened the door and motioned for him to follow. "Come on," she said, her voice now carrying an air of authority. "It's time to step out of the shadows." Marcus hesitated for just a moment before taking his first step out of the holding cell. The cool air of the station felt different now, somehow more oppressive. As he walked, he could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him, but there was also something else, a strange sense of power that he couldn't ignore. He wasn't just some kid anymore. He was Marcus Kingsley, and the world was about to see him for who he really was. The officers at their desks looked up as they saw Marcus and the woman walking past, but no one said anything. They didn't recognize him. To them, he was still just a kid, a nobody. But Marcus was about to make sure they would never forget his name. The woman led him to the front desk where a receptionist was sitting, idly typing away at a computer. "Is Captain Wright in?" she asked, her voice cool but commanding. The receptionist glanced up, clearly surprised by the question. Yeah, I think he's in his office," she replied. "Why?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to Marcus and gave him a nod. "This is where the fun begins," she said softly, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. Marcus didn't have time to ask questions. He followed her down the hallway, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the station. His mind was racing. What was going to happen when they reached Captain Wright? Would he know who Marcus was? Would he finally understand how wrong everything had been? When they reached the captain's office, the woman knocked lightly on the door before entering. Captain Wright, a man in his late 40s with graying hair and a stern face, looked up from his desk, clearly surprised to see them. "What's going on here?" Captain Wright asked, his tone stern, as if expecting some kind of explanation. The woman didn't waste any time. "This is Marcus Kingsley," she said, her voice firm, "the heir to Kingsley Enterprises." For a moment the words hung in the air, and Marcus could see the captain's expression change, his eyes narrowing as if he couldn't quite process what he was hearing. The name Kingsley clearly meant something to him, but it took him a few seconds to fully grasp the weight of the situation. Marcus stood tall, his posture straight and unwavering. He didn't flinch, didn't let his nerves get the best of him. This was his moment. He was tired of being treated like a nobody. He was tired of being judged based on his appearance. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you've made a huge mistake," Marcus said, his voice steady, even though he could feel the tension in the room rising. "I'm not some kid you can just arrest because of the way I look. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Captain Wright blinked, clearly taken aback. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The realization seemed to dawn on him, slowly at first, as if he were trying to piece together the story in his head. The name Kingsley wasn't something he could ignore. The woman stepped forward, her tone a little sharper now. "You've been treating this young man like a criminal, Captain. You've been profiling him based on your assumptions. Do you realize what kind of mistake that is?" Captain Wright looked at Marcus, then back at the woman, his face reddening with embarrassment. I didn't know. I didn't mean to. His words trailed off, but he couldn't finish his sentence. His whole demeanor had shifted. The man who had been so sure of his authority just moments ago was now standing there, unsure and uncomfortable. Marcus didn't let him off the hook. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on the captain's. You didn't mean to? How many times have people like me heard that same excuse? I didn't mean to. But it doesn't change the fact that you treated me like I was a criminal. You didn't see me for who I really am. You saw a teenager who didn't fit your image, and you decided to treat me like I was less than human. The room fell silent. The weight of Marcus's words hung in the air. It was clear that Captain Wright had no idea how to respond. He had been so sure that Marcus was just another teenager to push around, another kid who didn't belong. But now, faced with the truth, he didn't know what to do with himself. Marcus felt a strange sense of power in this moment. It wasn't the power of money or status, it was the power of truth. The truth was that no one, not even the police, had the right to make assumptions about him based on the color of his skin. They didn't have the right to treat him like he was worthless. He wasn't going to let them get away with it anymore. I think it's time for you to take responsibility for what you've done, Marcus said, his voice calm but filled with authority. You can start by apologizing. Captain Wright didn't say anything at first. He stood there staring at Marcus as if trying to decide what to do. The tension in the room was unbearable. But then, slowly, he nodded. I'm sorry, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean to. Marcus didn't need to hear the apology. He had already heard enough empty apologies in his life. But the fact that the captain had said it meant something. It meant that the truth had reached him, at least for a moment. That's a start, Marcus replied, turning toward the woman who had been by his side the whole time. She gave him a nod, one that told him this was just the beginning of a much bigger conversation. Marcus wasn't done here, not by a long shot. The tension in the room was thick, but Marcus couldn't afford to linger on the awkward apology he had just received. This wasn't just about Captain Wright admitting his mistakes. This was about making sure that the entire system that allowed people like him to be mistreated would be held accountable. He wasn't just standing there to get an apology for himself. He was standing there to make sure no one else would go through what he had. As the silence stretched, Marcus took a slow step forward, his eyes locked onto the captain's. You don't get it, do you? This isn't about one mistake or one arrest. It's about the fact that you and people like you think you can decide who belongs and who doesn't. It's about profiling, about assumptions, about treating people like they don't matter just because of what they look like. I'm not the only one who's been treated this way. Captain Wright didn't say anything this time. His face was pale, his eyes wide, as if the full weight of Marcus's words had finally hit him. But Marcus wasn't finished. The system is broken, and I'm here to make sure it changes, Marcus continued, his voice rising now. I don't care if you thought you were doing your job. What you did was wrong. What you do every day is wrong. And people like me, people who don't fit your idea of who's worthy of respect, shouldn't have to live with this fear. The woman who had been with him from the start watched closely, her face neutral, but her eyes full of approval. She knew Marcus wasn't just talking to Captain Wright anymore. He was speaking to every person in that room who had ever looked at someone like him and assumed they didn't belong. He was speaking for everyone who had been treated like a criminal for no reason other than their skin color. You've got power, Captain, Marcus said, his voice now cold and firm. But it's time for you to use it for something good. For once, stop hiding behind your badge and admit that you've been wrong. Admit that you have a responsibility to the people you serve, not just to your own prejudices. For a moment, Captain Wright stood frozen, looking between Marcus and the woman who was still standing by the door. It was clear that Marcus's words had shaken him. The apology had been a half-hearted attempt, but now, in the presence of someone who knew the truth and who could make that truth known to the world, the captain was starting to realize the weight of his actions. But Marcus wasn't looking for just an apology anymore. He wanted change, and if Captain Wright wouldn't make that change himself, Marcus would ensure that it happened. Turning away from Captain Wright, Marcus took a deep breath. His hand clenched into a fist, but he kept it at his side. He wasn't angry anymore. He was focused, determined. This was just the beginning. "I don't know if you'll change, Captain," Marcus said as he turned back. "But I'm going to make sure people like you are held accountable. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." The woman stepped forward now, her voice carrying an undeniable authority. "We're going to make sure of it," she added, looking directly at Captain Wright. "And you can either be part of the solution or you can be part of the problem. The choice is yours." The captain nodded reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable, but he remained silent. Marcus knew that his words had made an impact, and for the first time, he felt a sense of control over the situation. It wasn't just about getting out of this police station. It was about showing them that they couldn't just get away with treating people like him any longer. As Marcus turned to leave the room with the woman by his side, he could feel the eyes of the officers on him. They had no idea who he truly was, but they would. And soon enough, everyone would know who he was and what he stood for. This was just the start of something much bigger. The woman led Marcus down the hallway, away from Captain Wright's office. There was no more time for pleasantries or small talk. Marcus was no longer the scared teenager who had been thrown into a holding cell for something he didn't deserve. He had stepped into something much bigger, something that would change not only his life, but the lives of countless others. As they passed the front desk, the receptionist glanced up, her eyes widening when she saw Marcus again. But this time, it wasn't confusion or suspicion in her gaze. This time, there was a glimmer of something else. Realization. The woman opened the door to the exit, and as they stepped outside, the bright sun hit Marcus's face, momentarily blinding him. The outside world felt like a different place now. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He wasn't just someone who had been mistreated and judged based on his skin color. He was Marcus Kingsley, and he was about to make sure that the world knew exactly what that meant. As they reached the parking lot, the woman turned to him with a satisfied smile. "You did well in there," she said, her voice warm now. "You spoke with more authority than most adults ever could. You're ready." Marcus glanced at her, still processing everything that had just happened. "Ready for what?" he asked, still unsure about where all of this was leading. She looked at him seriously. "Ready to take your place. You're not just the heir to Kingsley Enterprises anymore. You're someone who can make a real difference, who can make sure no one else is ever treated like you were today. It's time to step up." Marcus swallowed hard. The words hit him harder than he expected. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or judged. He was fighting for a future where no one had to live in fear because of their race, their appearance, or their background. "I understand," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But this is just the beginning, right?" The woman nodded. "Exactly. You've got a long road ahead of you, Marcus, but you've already proven that you're ready for it." And just like that, Marcus understood. This wasn't just about his family's legacy or the wealth he had inherited. It was about using that power for something greater than himself. He had a responsibility now, a responsibility to stand up for what was right, to change the systems that had failed him and so many others. As the woman got into her car, she gave him one last look. "I'll be in touch. We've got a lot of work to do." Marcus watched her drive off, his mind racing. He wasn't sure exactly what came next, but he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning, and he was ready to change the world one step at a time. The next few days were a blur of emotions for Marcus. He tried to return to normal, pretending like everything had gone back to how it was before the police station incident. But it wasn't the same anymore. The way people looked at him, the way they treated him, it felt different. As if the world around him had shifted, but no one had told him how to keep up. He couldn't stop thinking about what the woman had said to him. "You're not just the heir to Kingsley Enterprises anymore. You're someone who can make a real difference." Those words haunted him, echoing in his mind at night as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't sure what it all meant, but the more he thought about it, the more it started to make sense. His life wasn't just about living in the shadow of his father's success anymore. It was about standing up, using his position for something meaningful. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from the woman. She wanted to meet again. Marcus hesitated for a moment. His heart raced. What now? But he knew he couldn't avoid it. He had a choice now, and the choice was his: to take control or to keep hiding. He typed a quick reply agreeing to meet. They set a time at a quiet cafe, one he frequented when he wanted to get away from the busy city and clear his mind. It was the same place where he used to go to relax, where he could pretend for just a little while that he was like everyone else, just a regular kid. But he wasn't regular anymore. As Marcus arrived, he noticed the woman already sitting at a corner table, her calm demeanor still as commanding as before. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, but there was something different in the way she looked at him now. Not with the same professional detachment, but with a sense of understanding, like she knew something about him that he hadn't even fully realized yet. "Marcus," she greeted him, her voice warm but steady. "I'm glad you made it." He nodded, sitting down across from her, his nerves still slightly on edge, though a sense of determination was starting to build inside him. "What's going on? What's next?" She studied him for a moment, as if evaluating how much to reveal. "Next," she began, her voice calm, "is about creating a plan. It's about taking what happened in that police station and making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Marcus frowned, unsure where she was leading. "But how? I mean, I don't know anything about changing the system. I don't have all the answers." The woman smiled, an almost reassuring gesture. "You don't need to know all the answers. That's why I'm here. We're going to start by getting you involved, helping you see the bigger picture. Kingsley Enterprises is more than just a business. It's a powerful platform, and it's time you started using it for something that matters." Marcus leaned in, intrigued. "What exactly are we talking about?" "I've been working with a group of people who have been fighting for criminal justice reform. We're going to take your platform, your father's company, and create something that makes a real impact, something that forces the world to pay attention." Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. This was bigger than he expected, bigger than just him. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this responsibility, but deep down he knew he had no choice. He had already stepped into something he couldn't walk away from. The woman continued, her tone resolute. "This isn't going to be easy. There will be resistance. There are people who don't want the system to change. But with your name, with your influence, we can make them listen." Marcus felt the weight of her words settle on him. He could feel his father's legacy pressing down on him, but it was different now. It wasn't just about keeping things running smoothly anymore. It was about shaking things up, disrupting the status quo. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Let's do it." From that day forward, Marcus's life was consumed with this new purpose. The days of walking through his high school halls, blending in and staying unnoticed, were behind him. He couldn't ignore the world around him anymore, not when there were so many people suffering because of the very system he had been born into. The woman, whose name was Sarah, became his mentor. She introduced him to people who had spent years working to reform the criminal justice system, to advocate for equality, to fight against the biases that ran so deeply through society. These people were lawyers, activists, community leaders, and most of them were surprised when they realized who Marcus really was. At first, they were skeptical, unsure of whether a wealthy heir like him could truly understand their struggles. But they were quickly won over by his passion and determination. One of the first steps was to speak publicly. It wasn't easy for Marcus. He was used to staying in the background, letting his father take the spotlight. But Sarah was adamant that if he wanted to make a difference, he had to step into the light. It was at a community rally, one focused on police reform, that Marcus took the stage for the first time. His hands shook as he held the microphone, but when he looked out at the crowd, something inside him clicked. They weren't there for a speech. They weren't there for the rich kid with the last name, Kingsley. They were there because they wanted change. They wanted someone to speak for them, someone who understood the injustices they faced. He cleared his throat and began. "My name is Marcus Kingsley, and I've lived a life most people could only dream of. I was born into privilege, into a family that built an empire. But that doesn't mean I've been blind to the problems in this country. I've seen how the system treats people of color, how it treats people who don't fit the mold of what society deems worthy of respect." He paused, letting his words sink in. The crowd was quiet, waiting for him to continue. "I've been on the receiving end of the system's assumptions. I've been judged because of my skin color, treated like I didn't belong. But I'm here to tell you, it doesn't have to be this way. We can make a change. Together." The crowd erupted into applause, and Marcus felt a rush of emotions flood over him. He had done it. He had stepped up, and it was only the beginning. From that moment on, Marcus became the face of the movement. He worked with Sarah and the others, using his platform to push for policies that would prevent the kind of injustice he had experienced, and much worse, from continuing. The more he spoke, the more people listened. And the more he realized that the true power of his family's legacy wasn't in the wealth or the name, but in the ability to use it for something bigger than himself. Marcus wasn't just changing the system. He was becoming part of a larger movement, a movement for justice, equality, and a better future. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly who he was. He wasn't just Marcus Kingsley, heir to an empire. He was Marcus Kingsley, a force for change, and the world was finally starting to notice. As the weeks went by, Marcus found himself immersed in the cause. His life had become a whirlwind of meetings, public speeches, and late-night brainstorming sessions with Sarah and other activists. Each day brought new challenges, new lessons, and more resistance from those who were comfortable with the way things had always been. But Marcus wasn't discouraged. In fact, the more opposition he faced, the more determined he became. He quickly learned that changing a system entrenched in bias wasn't going to happen overnight. It took time, patience, and, more importantly, people willing to stand up and say that enough was enough. As he worked with grassroots organizations, lawyers, and fellow activists, Marcus began to see how deeply connected everything was. From police reform to education inequality, the same issues kept coming up. People of color being denied opportunities, being treated unfairly or worse, being criminalized simply for existing in spaces where they were not supposed to be. Despite the long hours and the emotional toll of the work, Marcus never once considered backing down. Each time he spoke at rallies or conferences, he saw the faces of people who felt unheard, and his resolve only grew stronger. He saw himself in them, the kids who had been overlooked, underestimated, or worse, profiled. But even as Marcus continued to gain influence and push for change, the world around him didn't seem to notice. Some people supported him, others were skeptical, and there were those who outright hated what he was doing. Among the doubters, there were whispers that he was only doing this for attention, that he was just another privileged kid trying to act like he understood the struggles of others. But Marcus didn't let the negativity slow him down. He knew why he was doing this, and that was all that mattered. It was at one of the larger rallies where Marcus was scheduled to give another speech that things took a turn. The crowd had gathered in the city square, some of them carrying signs demanding justice, others simply standing in solidarity. Marcus stood backstage, nerves running high, but the familiar fire in his chest kept him grounded. He had a job to do. As he stepped onto the stage, the roar of the crowd welcomed him. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces. People were looking to him for leadership. The weight of that responsibility was heavy, but he didn't flinch. He had learned not to let the pressure consume him. "This isn't about me," he began, his voice strong and clear, cutting through the noise of the crowd. "This is about all of us. This is about every single person who has been overlooked, ignored, or treated like they don't matter." The crowd fell silent as he spoke, their attention fixed entirely on him. "We have to stop letting people decide our worth based on what we look like or where we come from," he continued. "We have to stop letting systems built on inequality define us. It's time for a change, and that change starts now. It starts with us standing together, refusing to accept anything less than justice for all." The energy from the crowd was electric, their cheers and chants ringing through the air as Marcus's words echoed around the square. For the first time, Marcus didn't feel like the son of Robert Kingsley, the heir to an empire. He didn't feel like someone who had always been on the sidelines, watching others fight for change. He felt like a leader, a force in his own right. And in that moment he realized that the people who had doubted him, the people who thought he was just a kid with a name, didn't matter. What mattered was the movement he had started, the people he had inspired, and the change they were going to bring. The momentum from the rally carried Marcus and his team forward. As the weeks passed, the media began to take notice of the young man who was using his platform for something more than just wealth and privilege. His story spread, and people from all walks of life began to follow his lead. What started as a local movement soon began to grow, attracting attention from national news outlets, journalists, and even politicians. But with that attention came new challenges. While many praised Marcus for his courage and determination, others saw him as a threat. There were articles written questioning his motives, asking if he was truly committed to the cause or just using it for personal gain. Some called him a puppet for activists. Others dismissed him as another rich kid with a cause. Despite the criticism, Marcus didn't let it derail him. He knew there would always be people who doubted him, who would look for any reason to tear him down. But every time they did, it only fueled his desire to prove them wrong. One day, after a particularly heated interview with a political commentator who had attempted to discredit him, Marcus found himself questioning everything. He sat alone in his office at Kingsley Enterprises, the door closed behind him, the weight of the world on his shoulders. The pressure was building, and it was starting to take a toll on him. Was he really making a difference? Or was he just another voice in the crowd, shouting for change but not getting anywhere? He ran his hands through his hair, trying to shake off the doubt, but it lingered. That was when Sarah walked in, her calm presence offering him a moment of peace. She didn't need to say anything at first. She just sat beside him, waiting for him to speak. "I don't know if I'm doing enough," Marcus confessed, his voice strained. "I feel like no matter what I do, it's never enough. People are questioning me, questioning my intentions. Maybe I'm not the person they think I am." Sarah nodded, her eyes steady and filled with understanding. "Marcus, it's not about being perfect. It's about showing up every single day for the people who need it. You're making a difference. The fact that you're even questioning it shows that you care. That's what matters." Marcus looked at her, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. She was right. He wasn't supposed to have all the answers. He was supposed to keep moving forward no matter how hard it got. He had already come too far to turn back now. "I'm not giving up," Marcus said, determination returning to his voice. "This is just the beginning. I'll keep pushing, no matter what." Sarah smiled, her pride in him shining through. "I knew you would." The next few months were a whirlwind of victories and setbacks. each one pushing Marcus further into the spotlight. He became the face of a new movement, one that sought to dismantle systemic racism, not just in the police force, but in every institution that held power. His family's empire, Kingsley Enterprises, had always been a symbol of wealth and success. But now, Marcus was reshaping it. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a voice for the voiceless, using the resources of the company to fund initiatives for education reform, legal advocacy, and mental health services for communities affected by discrimination. But with every victory, there were new challenges. The more Marcus pushed for change, the more resistance he faced. It wasn't just coming from politicians or wealthy elites. It was also coming from people who had worked within his own company for years, people who were loyal to his father and had been used to running things a certain way. They didn't like the shift he was causing. They didn't understand why Marcus was so focused on social justice when Kingsley Enterprises could just focus on growing its wealth. At a board meeting one afternoon, Marcus sat at the head of the table, surrounded by his father's old colleagues and the senior management team. The air in the room was tense, thick with unspoken tension. One of the senior executives, a man named Gerald, stood up and addressed Marcus directly. "Look, Marcus, we all respect what you've been doing with the community, but this is a business. We're here to make money, not chase political causes. You can't let your personal views affect the direction of Kingsley Enterprises." Marcus felt the heat rising in his chest. It was a familiar argument, one he had heard before, but today something in him snapped. He wasn't going to let anyone diminish the work he was doing, not anymore. "Gerald, let me make one thing clear," Marcus said, his voice firm and commanding. "I didn't inherit this company to just make money. I inherited it to make a difference. I have a platform that most people will never have in their lifetimes, and I'm going to use it to change the world. You don't have to agree with my methods, but you will respect my mission." There was a long silence as the room processed his words. Gerald opened his mouth to argue, but Marcus cut him off before he could speak. "I'm not backing down, not from this," Marcus continued. "So if you can't support me in this, I suggest you start looking for a new place to work." His eyes scanned the room, meeting the gazes of the other executives. There was a pause, but slowly, a few of them nodded, resigned to the fact that they had no choice but to follow his lead. Gerald stayed silent, his frustration palpable, but he sat down, knowing he had lost this battle. As the meeting came to an end, Marcus stood up, feeling the weight of what he had just done. He had just asserted his authority in a way he hadn't before, and it felt good. There was no turning back now. He wasn't just a figurehead anymore. He was the leader of Kingsley Enterprises, and he was ready to shape it into something that truly represented his values. Weeks turned into months, and Marcus's efforts began to show real results. The changes he was pushing for in the company were slow but steady, and the public began to take notice. His initiatives were gaining traction, and he was being invited to speak at national conferences, on news outlets, and at charity galas. He wasn't just a rich kid anymore. He was someone who had become a beacon of hope for those who had felt invisible for far too long. One evening, after a particularly successful fundraiser that raised millions for racial justice initiatives, Marcus stood on the balcony of his family's penthouse overlooking the city. The lights stretched out before him, a symbol of everything he had built and everything he was still working toward. The party inside was filled with wealthy donors and corporate leaders who had pledged to support his mission, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of unease. As much as he appreciated the support, he knew it came with strings attached. Some of these people were only donating because they saw potential profit in Marcus's vision. They didn't care about the cause as much as they cared about being associated with it. Marcus took a deep breath, pushing those thoughts aside. The work was still worth it. His focus had never wavered. He wasn't doing this for accolades or praise. He was doing it because the world needed change, and he was in a unique position to make that happen. Just then, Sarah joined him on the balcony, stepping out from the glass doors and giving him a knowing smile. She could always read him, even when he tried to hide his concerns. "You're thinking too much," she said softly, standing beside him. "You can't change the world on your own, Marcus. You've got people who are willing to help you, but you can't let the pressure get to you. Just keep doing what you're doing." Marcus nodded, grateful for her support. "I know. It's just, sometimes it feels like the more we do, the harder it gets. I want to make sure we're making a real difference, not just putting a Band-Aid on everything." "You will," Sarah said, her voice steady. "You already are. You've already started a movement. There's no going back now." The words comforted him, but a part of him still wondered if he could truly make the kind of change he dreamed of. The road ahead was long, and the world wasn't going to change overnight. But as he stood there, looking out over the city that had once felt so distant and out of reach, he realized one thing. He was no longer just the heir to an empire. He was the person who was going to rewrite the rules, and nothing could stand in his way. The next major test for Marcus came when Kingsley Enterprises was faced with a public scandal that threatened to undo much of the work he had done. An investigation into the company revealed that, despite his best efforts, certain departments within the organization had been using discriminatory hiring practices. The revelation hit hard, especially after Marcus had worked so tirelessly to show the world that Kingsley Enterprises was a company built on integrity and fairness. The scandal was everywhere. News outlets ran stories about the company's failings, and social media exploded with criticism. The very people who had supported Marcus's initiatives now questioned his ability to lead. Some of them, the corporate donors and high-profile figures, started to back away, concerned that they might be tainted by association. The pressure was suffocating, and Marcus felt it more than anyone. But this time, Marcus wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let the mistakes of his company define him or his mission. He called an emergency board meeting and addressed the entire leadership team, his voice firm and unwavering. "This is unacceptable," Marcus began, looking around the room at the executives who had let this happen. "We are better than this, and we will do better. It's not just about fixing the problem, it's about completely overhauling the way we do business. We will audit every department, and anyone found responsible for discrimination will be held accountable." He paused, letting the words sink in. "This isn't just about cleaning up our image, it's about being the kind of company that stands for what's right. We have the power to set an example for the entire industry, and we will. But it starts with us being honest about our failures." The room was silent, and Marcus could see the unease in their eyes. For the first time since taking over, he felt like he was truly in control. He wasn't just inheriting the company, he was rebuilding it from the ground up, and no scandal or backlash was going to stop him. "I'm not asking for your support," Marcus continued. "I'm demanding that you do what's right. We owe it to our employees, our customers, and to ourselves. If you're not on board with that, then you don't belong here." His words were sharp, but they were also a call to action. He was no longer just a CEO. He was a leader with a purpose, and the time for compromise was over. The fallout from the scandal was swift, but Marcus was determined not to let it define him. In the days that followed the board meeting, Kingsley Enterprises launched a comprehensive internal review, with a dedicated team working tirelessly to identify the sources of the discriminatory practices. Marcus took charge, personally overseeing the process and demanding transparency from every department. The media frenzy continued, but Marcus refused to hide from the scrutiny. He appeared on television, giving interviews in which he admitted the company's mistakes and promised to hold everyone accountable. He knew that the public was watching, waiting for him to fail. They wanted to see whether he was just another CEO who would sweep problems under the rug, or if he would follow through on his promises. During one interview, a reporter asked Marcus why he thought Kingsley Enterprises had fallen into such a pattern of discrimination despite his own efforts to push for diversity. Marcus, though visibly frustrated, kept his composure. "Because systems don't change overnight," he said, "because power is always harder to relinquish than we think. But that doesn't mean I'll stop fighting for it. I didn't start this journey to fix the surface. I'm here to change the foundation. And that takes time. Change isn't just about fixing one thing, it's about rethinking everything." The response was powerful, and it resonated with many people who saw the effort Marcus was making to genuinely transform his company. It wasn't a perfect solution, but the honest admission of the company's failings, paired with a clear plan to address them, showed that Marcus wasn't going to shy away from difficult conversations. He was going to tackle the problem head-on, no matter how difficult it became. In the midst of all this, Marcus kept his focus on the bigger picture. He worked late into the nights, alongside Sarah and his team, to organize meetings with community leaders and civil rights organizations. These conversations were difficult, but they were necessary. Marcus wanted to show people that he was serious about the changes he was pushing for. He wasn't just another CEO looking to check off diversity boxes. He was trying to create real, lasting change that would affect people beyond his company. Despite the pressure and the setbacks, Marcus found himself more committed than ever. With every conversation, every difficult decision, he felt his sense of purpose grow. He wasn't just fighting for the company's future anymore. He was fighting for a more just world. In the following months, Marcus's actions began to show concrete results. The company's internal review revealed widespread issues, but it also led to a transformative shift in the company's culture. Kingsley Enterprises overhauled its hiring practices, implemented extensive diversity training programs, and put policies in place to ensure that discrimination would not be tolerated. Marcus also worked with external advisors to help the company build more inclusive partnerships. The organization committed to mentoring minority-owned businesses, providing funding for community outreach programs, and supporting educational initiatives aimed at breaking the cycle of inequality. It wasn't just about fixing the internal problems of the company. Marcus was using his position to effect positive change on a wider scale. The press, which had once been filled with skepticism and criticism, began to take notice of the progress. More articles were written about the company's transformation, and soon Kingsley Enterprises became an example for other businesses trying to implement similar changes. Of course, there were still critics. There always would be. But the results spoke for themselves. One of the most significant milestones came when Marcus announced a partnership with a national nonprofit focused on criminal justice reform. The partnership would provide grants and support for organizations working to reduce mass incarceration and create programs for those who had been unfairly treated by the justice system. It was a direct response to the issues Marcus had become passionate about since his own encounter with the police. And it was a way for him to show that his commitment to reform was more than just words. It was backed by action. On the day of the announcement, Marcus stood alongside leaders of the nonprofit organization and spoke about the importance of addressing systemic racism. His speech was filled with determination and hope, and the room was filled with people who were eager to see change happen. He spoke not just as a CEO, but as someone who had lived through the struggles of those fighting for a fairer system. "We are in a moment of reckoning," Marcus said, his voice steady. "We've seen the damage that inequality has done to our communities, our families, and our future. Now it's time to take action, and Kingsley Enterprises is proud to stand with those who have been fighting for justice. It's time for all of us to work together to build a world where fairness and opportunity are available to everyone, regardless of the color of their skin." The crowd erupted into applause, and for a moment Marcus allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had accomplished. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. He was no longer just the heir to a business. He was a leader who had managed to turn a personal journey into a movement that was changing lives. As Kingsley Enterprises gained more respect for its efforts in creating positive change, Marcus's own journey took another unexpected turn. One morning, he received a letter from his father, Robert Kingsley, who had been mostly absent throughout Marcus's public transformation. Robert, a man who had built an empire through his own hard work, had always kept his distance from Marcus's social justice efforts, but the letter revealed something that took Marcus by surprise. The letter was filled with words of encouragement and pride. It was the first time in a long while that Marcus had heard his father express admiration for the work he was doing. Robert wrote about how proud he was of his son's leadership and the way Marcus had handled the scandals and controversies with grace. And most importantly, Robert told Marcus that he had finally realized that the future of Kingsley Enterprises lay not in preserving the past, but in embracing the future, a future of equality and fairness. The letter ended with Robert acknowledging that Marcus had the ability to take the company in new directions that he, as the old guard, could never have imagined. He had been wrong about a lot of things, but Marcus had shown him that change was possible, even in a company built on centuries of tradition. Reading those words, Marcus felt a rush of emotions. For years he had sought his father's approval, but he had never expected it to come in the form of a letter after all the battles they had fought, silently and openly. He wasn't sure how this would affect the future of the company, but in that moment, he realized something important. His father had given him the greatest gift of all, his trust. Marcus folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer. He didn't need to hold on to it to prove his worth. He had already proven that he was capable of leading, capable of making tough decisions, and capable of using his platform to change the world. His father's approval was just a bonus, not the reason he kept going. As Marcus sat back in his chair, looking out at the city skyline from his office window, he knew that the road ahead would still be filled with challenges. But now, he was no longer fighting just for himself or for his father's legacy. He was fighting for everyone who had been left behind, for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. And he wasn't about to stop now. A few weeks later, Marcus stood in front of a crowd once more, this time at a massive rally in Washington, D.C. The atmosphere was electric, filled with thousands of people from all walks of life who had come to support the cause. This wasn't just another speech. This was the culmination of everything Marcus had worked toward, the result of months of tireless work, struggle, and perseverance. As he stood at the podium, he could feel the weight of the moment. He had gone from being the heir to an empire to being a symbol of change. The world had watched him struggle, fail, and rise again, and now the world was watching as he prepared to take the next step in his journey. I stand here today not just as Marcus Kingsley, but as someone who believes that we can change the world, he began, his voice filled with passion. We can change the systems that have kept people oppressed for generations. We can make sure that no one is left behind. The crowd cheered, their voices rising in unison. It was a sound of hope, of unity, and of progress. This is just the beginning, Marcus continued. We've started something that can't be stopped, a movement that will outlive all of us, and together we will make sure that every person, no matter where they come from or what they look like, has a place in this world. As the crowd erupted into applause, Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, he didn't feel alone. He was surrounded by people who shared his vision, who believed in the change he was fighting for. And with their support, Marcus knew there was nothing they couldn't accomplish together. He had found his purpose, and now he was ready to change the world.